The first thing I noticed was the color. Not the fact that somebody had painted on my property, not the fact that my driveway suddenly looked different. It was the color. Bright yellow. The kind of yellow you only use when you want people to pay attention. I remember pulling into my neighborhood that Tuesday afternoon, thinking about absolutely nothing important. I'd stopped for gas on the way home, grabbed a coffee. I probably shouldn't have been drinking that late in the day, and I was halfway planning dinner in my head when I turned onto my street. Nothing felt unusual. Maple Hollow wasn't exactly the kind of place where exciting things happened. Retired couples walked their dogs. Kids rode bikes. People argued about lawn fertilizer and then waved at each other the next morning. It was predictable, comfortably predictable. Then I pulled into my driveway and hit the brakes. Hard, because there, cutting straight across the entrance to my property, were 3 freshly painted yellow parking restriction lines. I just sat there staring through the windshield. At first, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong house. Sounds ridiculous, I know. But your brain does funny things when reality suddenly stops matching memory. I blinked, looked at my mailbox, my front porch, the oak tree I'd planted 12 years earlier. Nope, definitely my house, and definitely my driveway. The problem was those lines weren't supposed to be there. I got out of my truck and walked closer. The paint was still shiny, still wet in a couple spots. I could smell it. Whoever did it had probably finished less than an hour earlier. Now, most people would have immediately gotten angry, maybe started making phone calls, maybe marched straight over to a neighbor's house looking for answers. That's never really been my style. I've always been the guy who gets quiet when something doesn't make sense. Not because I'm passive, because I'm curious. And curiosity has saved me from making a lot of expensive mistakes over the years. So instead of reacting, I crouched down and looked closer. Then something caught my eye. The lines didn't stop where they should have. They crossed the curb. They crossed the utility easement. And they continued nearly 6 feet onto my property. My actual property. I stood up slowly. Now, that was different. That wasn't cosmetic. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a boundary issue. And boundary issues tend to get expensive. I walked inside, set my coffee on the kitchen counter, and headed straight for a filing cabinet most people would probably throw away during a spring cleaning project. Inside was every document related to my property. Closing paperwork, survey records, county filings, permit applications, the boring stuff, the stuff nobody cares about until suddenly it matters. 10 minutes later, I had the original plat map spread across my kitchen island. I grabbed a tape measure and headed back outside. One measurement, then another, then another. Every number told the same story. The paint wasn't near the property line. It wasn't close. Whoever approved this had either ignored the boundary completely or never bothered checking it. I took pictures, lots of pictures, wide shots, close-ups, measurements visible, timestamps enabled. Experience had taught me something years ago. Memory is evidence until real evidence shows up. Then memory becomes irrelevant. As I was taking photos, my next-door neighbor, an older woman named Linda Mercer, stepped outside carrying groceries. She glanced toward the driveway, then immediately looked away. That caught my attention. People only avoid eye contact when they know something. "Afternoon, Linda." She smiled nervously. "Hey, Caleb. Something happened around here today?" For a second, she looked like she wanted to answer. Then she sighed. "You didn't hear from me." That was all I needed. I walked a little closer. Linda lowered her voice. "The HOA had contractors out here this morning." My stomach tightened. "Contractors?" She nodded. They were marking parking zones. A bunch of residents complained about overflow vehicles near the clubhouse. I looked back toward the yellow paint. Did anyone mention my driveway? Linda laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it wasn't. "You know how Darren Walsh is?" And there it was. The name. Darren Walsh, president of the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association. A man who somehow treated neighborhood regulations like federal law. I'd crossed paths with him before. Nothing dramatic. Just enough small disagreements over the years to know he enjoyed authority a little too much. The last time we'd spoken, he'd tried citing me for a work trailer parked in my own driveway for 2 days. 2 days. He lost that argument too. Looking back, maybe he remembered that. Maybe I was already on his list. Or maybe this really was just incompetence. At that moment, I honestly didn't know. But I intended to find out. That evening, I called the county records office and requested certified copies of everything connected to my parcel. Then I checked the HOA website. The monthly board meeting was scheduled for Thursday night, 48 hours away. Perfect, because if somebody thought they could paint first and ask questions later, they were about to discover something important. The yellow lines weren't the real problem. The assumption behind them was. And sitting at my kitchen table that night, staring at the photographs spread across the wood grain surface beneath a single lamp, I had a feeling this story was only getting started. Thursday night arrived faster than I expected. Funny how that happens when you know a confrontation is waiting for you. The entire day felt stretched tight, like a cable under tension. I went through my normal routine, answered emails, returned a few calls, even met a client for lunch. But part of my brain kept circling back to those yellow lines sitting across my driveway like a challenge. By 6:30, I was walking into the Maple Hollow clubhouse, carrying a leather folder packed with documents. The room looked exactly the way HOA meeting rooms always look. Cheap coffee, folding chairs, people pretending they're interested in discussions about shrub maintenance. A few familiar faces nodded as I walked in. Others suddenly became very interested in their phones. That alone told me more than I needed to know. News travels fast in neighborhoods, especially when somebody does something they probably shouldn't have done. I took a seat near the back and listened while the board worked through their agenda. Mailbox colors, pool maintenance costs, holiday decoration guidelines, the usual nonsense. Then Darren Walsh adjusted his glasses and looked down at the sign-in sheet. Next homeowner comment. His eyes lifted. For half a second, our gazes met. Then he smiled. Not warmly, not politely. The kind of smile a poker player gives when he thinks he's holding all the cards. Mr. Carter. I stood and walked to the front. The room got noticeably quieter. I set my folder on the table and opened it. Earlier this week, I began. Parking restriction markings were painted across my driveway and extended several feet onto my private property. I slid photographs toward the board, then copies of the plat map, then measurement records. Simple, clear, professional. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I was giving them an opportunity to fix a mistake. Darren barely glanced at the documents. That bothered me more than if he'd argued, because it told me he'd already made up his mind. The area in question, he said, leaning back in his chair, has been designated shared access space. I blinked. Designated by whom? The board. A few people shifted uncomfortably. I looked around the room. Nobody seemed eager to make eye contact. I pointed to the plat map. This is a recorded county document. Darren shrugged. The board has authority over community access management, not property boundaries. His smile widened. The board disagrees. Now here's the thing. When someone says something that's objectively wrong with complete confidence, it creates a strange moment in your head. Part of you wants to laugh. Part of you wants to argue. And part of you realizes arguing would be a waste of time. I was beginning to feel all three. I took a slow breath. Darren, with respect, a homeowners association doesn't have authority to redefine recorded property lines. His expression hardened, and there it was. The first crack. This wasn't about parking. It wasn't about community access. It was about being challenged. The room got quieter. You could almost feel people waiting to see what happened next. Then Darren reached into a stack of papers, pulled one free, and slid it across the table toward me. I looked down. Violation notice. Fine amount, $250. I actually laughed. Not loudly, just enough for a couple people to turn their heads. The violation description read, obstruction of community access area. I looked back up. My driveway is obstructing community access? Correct. My driveway that sits entirely on my property. The board determination is final. For a second, nobody spoke. Then one of the older residents, sitting near the wall, let out a small cough that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Darren shot him a look. Silence returned immediately. I picked up the notice, folded it once, then slipped it into my folder. Understood. That's all I said. Understood. No argument. No raised voice. No threats. And that seemed to confuse Darren more than anything else. Because people like Darren expect resistance. They're prepared for anger, prepared for complaints, prepared for emotional reactions. They're not prepared for calm. As I turned to leave, he called after me. The fine is due within 14 days. I nodded. Good to know. I walked out. The cool evening air hit me as I stepped into the parking lot. I stood there for a moment staring at the clubhouse windows. Inside, Darren was probably feeling pretty satisfied with himself. The board had spoken. The homeowner had lost. Case closed. At least that's what he thought. By the time I got home, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused because there was something Darren didn't know. Something nobody in that room knew. And honestly, I preferred it that way. I sat down at my desk shortly after 8 o'clock, opened a blank document, and started writing. Not an email, not a complaint. A case file. Clean, structured, precise. The kind of document built to survive scrutiny. Because for the last 19 years, I've worked as a licensed land surveyor. Not the kind people imagine standing beside highways with orange vests. I'm talking about boundary litigation, property disputes, court-certified surveys. The kind of work where one incorrect measurement can cost somebody hundreds of thousands of dollars. I've testified in legal proceedings, resolved easement conflicts, worked cases involving municipalities, developers, and commercial property owners. Property boundaries weren't a hobby for me. They were my profession. And as I reviewed the photographs from my driveway, I realized something almost funny. The HOA hadn't accidentally picked a fight with a homeowner. They had accidentally picked a fight with the person most qualified in the entire neighborhood to prove they were wrong. Around 10 o'clock, I called an old friend named Victor Reyes. Victor was an attorney specializing in property law. We'd worked together on several cases over the years. He answered on the second ring. What's on fire? I laughed. Technically nothing. Yet, after listening for 5 minutes, Victor whistled. They painted on your land? About 6 feet. Certified? Not yet. Want it certified? Tomorrow. There was a brief pause. Then he chuckled. I almost feel bad for them. Almost. By midnight, everything was in motion. Survey crew scheduled. Legal review underway. Documentation organized. County records confirmed. And for the first time since discovering those yellow lines, I slept well. The next morning started before sunrise. At exactly 8 o'clock, a survey truck rolled into my driveway. 2 technicians stepped out. Then another truck arrived. Then another. Professional equipment started appearing across the property. Tripods, data collectors, survey markers, precision instruments worth more than some cars. Across the street, curtains started moving. Neighbors peeked through windows. People walking dogs slowed down. By 8:30, half the neighborhood was quietly trying to figure out what was happening. Linda wandered over carrying a travel mug. What on earth did you do? I smiled. Paperwork. She laughed. No, seriously. Trust me, Linda. I pointed toward the equipment. This is what paperwork looks like when it grows up. She nearly spit out her coffee. Meanwhile, the survey team worked methodically. No guesses, no assumptions, just facts. By 9:15, the results were finalized. The legal property line had been established beyond any reasonable dispute. The yellow paint wasn't near the boundary. It wasn't close. It wasn't even defensible. And that was exactly what I needed. Because while the survey crew was finishing outside, Victor was already filing something else. Not a warning, not a demand letter, an official legal complaint. Trespass, property defacement, damages, professional verification attached. Every piece backed by certified evidence. And as I reviewed the completed paperwork sitting on the hood of my truck, another thought entered my mind. A very specific thought. One that made me smile. I checked my watch. 9:32 a.m. The HOA's monthly open board session started at 10, which meant I still had just enough time to make one final phone call. The kind of phone call that would turn an ordinary Thursday morning into something the entire neighborhood will be talking about for years. The company answered on the second ring. I told them I needed a pressure washing crew at a residential address at exactly 10 o'clock. Not 10:05, not 10:15, 10 sharp. The woman on the phone asked what needed to be cleaned. I looked out at the yellow paint cutting across my driveway and smiled. Unauthorized markings on private property. She paused, then said, Well, that's a new one. By 9:55, I was sitting quietly in the back row of the HOA meeting room. Same folding chairs, same cheap coffee, same people. The board members were settling into their seats while homeowners chatted about landscaping projects and summer events. Darren looked relaxed, confident, like a man whose biggest concern that morning was approving next month's clubhouse budget. At exactly 10 a.m., a truck pulled into my driveway. I couldn't see it from inside the room, but I heard it, the low rumble of a diesel engine. A minute later came the sound that changed everything, the steady mechanical growl of a commercial pressure washer. Several heads turned toward the windows. Conversation stopped. Darren glanced up briefly, then returned to his notes. The sound grew louder, more persistent. Curiosity started spreading through the room. One homeowner stood and peeked through the blinds. Then another. Finally, one of the board members frowned. "What's going on outside?" Nobody answered, because by then everyone was looking, including Darren. He stood slowly and walked toward the window. I watched his reflection in the glass. At first he looked annoyed, then confused, then very, very still. Outside, the bright yellow lines he'd fought so hard to defend were disappearing. Water blasted across the concrete. Paint peeled away in long strips. The driveway underneath emerged clean and untouched, like the markings had never belonged there in the first place. Darren spun around. "What the hell is this?" The room went silent. I stood, not dramatically, just calmly, like a man getting up to leave church. "Property maintenance." His face reddened. "You can't remove HOA markings." I tilted my head slightly. "Actually, I can." Without another word, Darren stormed outside. Most of the room followed, including me. The scene waiting outside felt almost cinematic. The pressure washing crew worked with professional focus, completely uninterested in neighborhood politics. Water sprayed across the concrete. Paint vanished. Sunlight reflected off clean pavement. And standing right in the center of everything were the freshly installed survey stakes, marking the certified property boundary. Facts made visible. Darren marched directly toward the crew leader. "You need to stop immediately." The man looked up. "Why?" "Those markings belong to the HOA. The crew leader shrugged. "We were hired to remove paint from private property." "It isn't private property." That was when I stepped forward and handed him the folder. The same folder he'd ignored 2 nights earlier. Except now, it contained considerably more information. Certified survey reports, county documentation, photographic evidence, legal filings, attorney correspondence. Everything neatly organized. Everything official. Darren took the folder. For the first time since this started, he actually read. Really read. I watched his eyes move across the pages. Watched the confidence slowly drain from his expression. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody gasped. Nobody shouted. That's not how reality works. The biggest moments are usually quiet. You simply watch someone realize they've been standing on the wrong side of the truth. One board member stepped closer, then another. Soon they were reading over his shoulder. The mood changed almost immediately. People who had supported him suddenly became very interested in distancing themselves from the decision. Funny how fast that happens. One woman from the board looked genuinely horrified. "Wait, nobody verified the property line?" Nobody answered. She looked at Darren. "You told us it was community access space." Still no answer. The silence was becoming painful. Finally, Darren cleared his throat. "This may require further review." I almost laughed. May require? The pressure washing crew continued working. Nobody stopped them, because nobody could. Every square inch being cleaned sat inside my legally documented property boundary. The law wasn't complicated. The evidence wasn't ambiguous. And suddenly, all that confidence from the board meeting 2 days earlier seemed to have evaporated. By 10:45, the last trace of yellow paint was gone. The crew packed their equipment, collected signatures, and left. Just like that. The fight was over. At least the visible part of it. The legal part continued quietly in the background. Weeks passed. The neighborhood returned to normal. Kids rode bicycles. Dogs barked at squirrels. People mowed lawns. Life moved forward. But something had changed. Not just for me. For everyone. Because once residents saw the board make a mistake that obvious, they started asking more questions. Reading documents. Attending meetings. Paying attention. And honestly, I think that worried the HOA more than the lawsuit ever did. 3 weeks later, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a formal statement. The violation notice had been rescinded. The $250 fine had been canceled. The board acknowledged the markings had been placed beyond HOA authority. The contractor responsible had been terminated from future projects, and their insurance carrier had opened a claim. By the time everything was finalized, the settlement covered survey costs, legal expenses, property restoration, and additional damages. The total wasn't life-changing money, but it wasn't supposed to be. That was never the point. The point was accountability. 43 days after the paint first appeared, the case was closed. No dramatiko showdown. No public apology. No viral social media moment. Just signatures, checks, paperwork. The way most real victories happen. Today my driveway looks exactly the same as it did before all of this started. Same concrete. Same mailbox. Same oak tree. The only difference is a pair of permanent survey markers near the edge of the property. Some neighbors have asked why I left them there. The answer is simple. They're not a warning. They're not a trophy. They're a reminder. A reminder that facts don't care who sits on a board. Facts don't care who speaks the loudest. Facts don't care who thinks they're in charge. They're either true or they aren't. And eventually reality catches up with everyone. Looking back, the biggest lesson wasn't about property lines. It wasn't even about the HOA. It was about something much more common. A lot of people surrender their ground because authority sounds convincing. Someone speaks confidently, wears a title, sits behind a table, and suddenly we assume they must know better. But confidence and correctness aren't the same thing. Never have been. The moment we stop asking questions, the moment we stop verifying facts, that's when overreach begins. Not with force, with assumption. And maybe that's the part that still sticks with me all these years later. Because I've wondered sometimes what would have happened if I hadn't known how to read a plat map. What if I wasn't a surveyor? What if I had simply paid the fine and accepted their version of reality? Would those yellow lines still be there today? Would the boundary have slowly shifted in people's minds until everyone forgot where it actually belonged? Honestly, I don't know. And that's exactly why I think these situations matter. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a neighborhood board, a local committee, or even a boss who crossed the line simply because they assumed nobody would challenge them? Did you fight back? Did you walk away? Or did you decide keeping the peace was easier than proving a point? Drop your story in the comments because I'm genuinely curious where people draw that line between cooperation and standing their ground. And here's the question that still sparks arguments every time I tell this story. Was Darren knowingly abusing his authority, or was he just another guy who got so comfortable being in charge that he stopped checking whether he was actually right? Let me know what you think.